anytime you put a face on things, you humanize it. And so that changes the way people think about things.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching Frank Schaeffer Conversations or Conversations with Frank Schaeffer with my friend Joel Barrett today, who is the author of a new book, Godly But Gay. And I know about this book because Joel kindly sent it to me to read an advance copy as a PDF file a couple months ago. I really loved it. People do send books to other authors for comments, and sometimes I have to admit, I skim. But in this case, I couldn't because the writing was too good. And Godly But Gay is one of the better books I've read recently, period. And in terms of the struggle of those who are Christians who are also gay and then marry someone who is also gay, and then on top of that come at it from being a pastor, it gets really complicated. So when I read the book, I just didn't know where it would go, but it struck me very, very powerfully. So I'm going to start by doing something here that I have not ever asked anybody else to do in these conversations. Joel, I want you to read my endorsement of your book in full from the inside front cover. I know I'm also on the back of the book because I want people to know how I feel about it. And my writing is better than my speaking because I'm a writer. So read what I wrote. It's pretty good.
It is pretty good. I'll admit that. I was very pleased. You start with a quote from my book and you say, this is the quote: "You told me that I was perfectly made in God's image, but when you found out I was gay, you told me I was broken and an abomination." Joel Barrett writes in this masterclass on sexuality and faith. This book is the most devastating yet hope-filled critique of the false promises of fundamentalist Christianity I've ever read, period. It is a very important work because few people seem to understand that the most religiously fervent and godly people in America are gay. Joel is one such person, former pastor, father, and husband. He has written a gem of a book on the human journey we all take, whatever our sexual orientation or gender.
Well, every word was meant, and your book inspired a good blurb, as we call these things, but it was more than that, because I found, having had my own journey out of a very evangelical fundamentalist background that challenged me in a lot of ways, that I had so many things that I loved about your book. And what I liked best was not your journey as a gay man, but your journey as a fellow traveler on the same path that I've been on, just on a bit of a different offshoot of it. So let's recap for a minute, Joel, the story that you tell in Godly But Gay. So let's spend a few minutes. I've just sat down next to you on an airplane. I look fairly friendly. Maybe I've spilled a drink, and we've mocked it up and broken the ice, and I ask who you are, and you tell me your story. How would you tell that story?
Sure, Frank, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah.
I grew up in an extremely conservative Baptist home, and usually when I say that, the first thing out of people's mouths, they go like, "Oh, you mean Southern Baptist?" And I go, "No, we thought the Southern Baptists were too liberal." And so I tell them, I said, try to imagine the softer side of the Westboro Baptist Church. That's closer to
Wow.
That's a little bit closer. And then I tell them, I was like, I spent my whole life, I always knew I was gay, but trying not to be, because that just wasn't an option. It wasn't accepted. So I kept trying to do all the right things. Whatever the church, the pastors, whatever would tell me, I tried my hardest to do all of those things, which eventually led me to going to Bible college, studying for ministry, marrying a woman, going into ministry. And I spent about 13 years as a Baptist pastor. Yes. And really struggled all the whole time. Eventually, a series of events took me where I decided to, my last ditch effort, I was going to go. I called Focus on the Family, got a referral to Exodus International, called Exodus International, and ended up spending about 3 years in ex-gay, or what is more commonly known now as conversion therapy, to try to become straight.
And how long ago was that, by the way?
That would have been in the mid 2000s.
Okay. All right. So keep going. How did that work out? Very well, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, as you can see, my T-shirt
Yeah.
Here's really the nutshell, Frank. I always tell people it's kind of like after 3 years of conversion therapy, if this is me all gay and this is me all straight, after 3 years, I had made this much progress.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it felt like. It was like, this isn't working.
Did you do the conversion therapy after you were married to a woman?
Yes, this was in my mid 30s, late 30s, actually.
And was she all in on this? Like, you go do that and come back to me a straight male heterosexual?
Once I brought her into the conversation, yes. At first, she didn't know what was going on, but it became evident that I needed to bring her into the conversation. And then she was like, okay, well, go get that fixed, kind of thing. Yeah. So I knew it was my last ditch effort. And so like I said, I was living in Indiana at the time, and I was started by traveling about 3 hours to Indianapolis and seeing an ex-gay counselor there who told me he was the leader of the state of Indiana for Exodus. I went to some of the conferences. I heard people like Cy Rogers speak. I heard, I read the books. I watched the videos. I went to retreats. And then I ended up being referred to a counselor closer to me. I was in regular therapy with him, often reoccurring, and in group therapy. And yeah, it was definitely like I gave it my all because I knew.
And at some point within this passage, did you ever have a time when you had a sort of come to Jesus moment, said, okay, I've been cured. Thank you, Jesus, ran around, threw your crutches away, came up to the front, got slain in the spirit. I know I'm being facetious, but, and then after the whole healing meeting's done, it still hurts and doesn't work. Or did you never even get to that sort of emotional, magical moment?
Nothing like that at all. It just felt like so much work. I will admit, there were some good things that came out of it in the sense that somebody was helping me process a lot of things from my life. So in that kind of sense of the stereotypical therapist situation where, tell me about this thing that happened, how did that make you feel, those kinds of questions. Well, it was good for me to unpack some of that stuff because I'd never talked to anybody about it. It was the first time
it was nice to be listened to a little bit.
Yes. But the problem was there was this ulterior motive of trying to figure out what it was that would make you gay. And it was still based on the faulty idea that gay people are that way because, one, they either had a overbearing mother, an absentee or emotionally absent father, or some kind of sexual abuse. So I began to realize a lot of this unpacking was to try to get at that. And I even found myself like going, well, let's see, my mom was kind of a strong personality. My dad and I didn't really connect. And there was that kid in 8th grade that I messed around with, maybe that's why I'm gay. And yeah, I somehow thought that if I could find that, it would mean something. Looking back, I go, I don't know, let's say I did find out that. Well, then what?
Well,
but that
was the big divide between science and modernity and evangelical Christianity and other religious fundamentalisms is that they don't believe in the science anyway. So that, of course, all the subsequent explanations are kind of like, the anti-vaccine movement now rests on a lot of conspiracy theories. There's no way to dig down to what's under it. There is nothing under it because, of course, it's a rejection of science. So if you start from that place, there's nowhere to go, even if you have a nice therapist who listens to you. Basically, you're avoiding Massachusetts General Hospital and you're going to a local alchemist.
Yeah,
help.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the deal. You got cancer and he's going to turn lead into gold and he has some, a stone and some frog spawn and he's going to mix it into a pot and make it all work because, of course, that was the deal. So at what point did it I guess in the journey, I'm asking questions as if I haven't read the book because I want people to understand this is, you're part of the journey. But at what point in that journey did you begin to question more than just the interpretation of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity about gay people and sort of maybe question something wider in terms of just your own belief system, but also just the entire package?
There were 2 points that come to mind. One of which was that um, a lot of what I was told was, well, Joel, you've never had a healthy relationship with other men. You've sexualized these relationships. So you need to be real with people, and especially men, and start telling them what's going on in your life so that you can learn what it's like to build a healthy relationship with other men and not sexualize it. Well, that seemed to make sense at the time in my brain. I'm like, okay. So I started selecting some people in my life that I would be real with. Well, what was interesting is I think that it had the exact opposite impact of what they wanted. They thought somehow that would release me of these sexual things. Well, what it did instead is as I began to become real with more and more people. And the truth is, I hadn't been real with a lot of people. I'd never let anybody see me.
Sure.
So once I started doing that, well, to my surprise, not everybody, even people within the church, not everybody rejected me. There were many people that were like, oh, didn't know that. Bless your heart. What can I do to help? Kind of thing. Yeah. And there were some people who like, I don't care. There were some people who I did lose. But what that began to do is it began to strengthen me. And the point that I started going, but wait a minute. If now I'm being real and these people still are accepting me and I'm finding acceptance in broader and broader circles, why am I trying to change this?
Yes.
It was like, I'm finding peace, happiness, contentment with who I am. So it was taking away the motivation to even try to continue to change, because I'm like, this is actually pretty cool. I really like being real and having people like me as I am. I don't have to become something else. The other turning point for me was literally at the very tail end of after 3 years of therapy and that movement that I showed you with my hands, of feeling like, okay, I'm discouraged. This is not working. And I was sitting in these group sessions with other guys like myself, and had been in long enough now that I'm going, I realized I don't know anybody that's farther down this road than me. Like, we are all in the exact same place where we started. So I thought, well, I'm going to contact that original counselor who said he was the head of the state of Indiana for Access. I'm like, okay, so he's a part of this international network. Yeah, they surely must have this giant database of people that they could connect you to. So I just said, hey, Brad, I'm really struggling here. If this is as good as it gets, I don't know that I can keep on like this. It was that white knuckle kind of thing. Yeah. I was like, can you connect me to some people just like me, not some national speaker, but just some guy like me that would be able to say, hey, Joel, hang in there. I know what you're feeling. It'll be so much better. Just hang in there, kind of thing. And to my surprise, he emailed me back and said that he could not do that. He couldn't provide one single name. And I was like, that really bothered me, because I'm thinking, you don't have a bunch of these people? This is
well, like going back to the faith healer analogy I used a moment ago, this is the guy that throws his crutches away. The pain comes back because he has, lymphoma, and now it's going into his bones and it's going to kill him. And he writes to one of these faith healers that he's been faithfully sending money to and says, can you send me a list of other people with stage 4 cancer of my kind that I was healed from, that, they had this little relapse, but it all turned out fine. And of course, no list would be forthcoming.
Right.
Because this is a form of faith healing transposed into our sexuality. And of course, it has not only no basis in science, just like those faith healers, it's also fundamentally not just wrong in terms of mistaken, it is wrong in terms of incredibly cruel.
Yes.
When you think of the hoops that you were jumping through, trying to get to a goal where the goalposts will always be moved because there is no goal, because the whole game is false.
Well, and the funny thing, or maybe not funny, but the ironic thing is that a lot of these national speakers that I did follow back in the day have since all come out. I'm connected with friends to some of them, Sure. But
speaking of which, hold on a second. Is that movement still going, or did it really just sort of run its course and is so exposed as fraudulent with its own leaders having come out?
So the organization Exodus International is defunct. However, conversion therapy, ex-gay therapy, reparative therapy, whatever you want to call it,
right,
there's a billion names for the same thing, is still alive and well.
And who signs up for that stuff these days? Is it just evangelical fundamentalists from backgrounds like yours? Does it include conservative Roman Catholics? Are there Muslims who try to get cured by these same people coming from other kinds of fundamentalisms? What's the scope of the backgrounds that get folded into this?
Yeah, because the problem is, this isn't, let's talk about for a second. They're all across the United States. There are states that are banning conversion therapy, and municipalities who are putting laws in effect to say no conversion therapy for minors, no attempt to change that, which I'm supportive of and happy that's happening. However, that is not going to stop conversion therapy
No,
at all.
of course not.
Because the people who are practicing this are not licensed, state licensed therapists and counselors and social workers. They are almost 100% faith-based organizations.
Well, similarly, by the way, with parenting books written by people who give you explicit instructions on how to beat your child,
right,
and not leave marks. And until a little while ago, Amazon was distributing a lot of these books until there was an outcry. Then they pull a few. There's always somebody else that comes forward. They're not psychologists. They're not experts in anything. They're just very cruel, sometimes stupid people.
And it's presented as fact.
It doesn't matter what laws you make.
Yeah. So, it's churches, religious organizations. Sometimes it's done under the guise of addiction counseling, like a sexual addiction.
Yeah.
So the truth is, yes, there are many ways that you could go about finding this, but it's generally going to be through some sort of faith-based organization, whether it's a church, some kind of faith counseling center, those kinds of things. And it's not legislated, rule managed at all.
Yes.
There's no oversight because it's the church. And we don't touch the church with the 10-foot pole, whatever that means, church. And it can be, so I know Catholics. The other problem with this, like Catholics and evangelicals and all the people that you mentioned, the other problem is that because it's not based in any kind of science or reality, I can hang a plaque out and say, I can make you straight. I'm whatever it is I think. Like it's different no matter where you go. So you'll hear stories that, like in the Boy Erased story, where there's like literal physical abuse. And I have friends that have gone through some kind of electroshock therapy. And then there's people like me. Mine was much more the pray away the gay thing, and lots of demonic warfare and praying and that kind of stuff. So there's no standard. And what's happening now is that people who are still practicing, they keep renaming it.
Yes.
It's
just relabel the illegal practice. The thing is too, and of course you're very aware of this, Joel. And Joel, by the way, is the author of a fantastic book that I wrote a glowing endorsement for from my heart, Godly But Gay, available where books are available. Please get one. There it is. I asked him to hold it up because I read my copy not on paper. Then he very kindly sent me one, and I've stuck it somewhere, probably put it somewhere to make sure it doesn't get damaged or lost. And of course, now I can't find it. But I did read it. I wrote a nice comment about it. But just to broaden this huge circle here we're talking about, we also happen to be living at a moment when there is a pro-theocracy majority on the Supreme Court, that every time there is a challenge that comes to this closed religious system that claims religious liberty for abusing others, the court is more and more ruling in their favor, just working backwards to show it's not just personal, Joel, about gay people, it's anybody. They allowed these churches to meet, and when COVID was rampant and still is, and become super spreader centers because it was their religious liberty. The court with Amy Coney Barrett ruled in favor of that. They ruled for Hobby Lobby, the family, so they wouldn't have to include contraceptives in the insurance company, in the insurance coverage for females, on and on and on. So to contextualize your book, Godly But Gay, we're living at a time that whenever it is between the civil liberties of the general population and special exemptions for Christians and evangelical people to be cruel to others in the name of religious liberty, the court is ruling in their favor. So this is not, it's not like because there are some states which are outlawing conversion therapy, whatever they want to call it, whatever the new label is, we're okay. We're not okay. The big picture is worse than ever. And I just want you to comment on that.
Well, for example, I'd have to go back and look, but I don't think either one of the people I saw were like state licensed therapists.
Right.
I think they were well-intentioned. You know, they thought they were helping. But we have states right now that are not only against the conversion therapy bans, but are putting in legislation to prevent that from even being a possibility.
Yes.
That's really scary. Like
Yes.
they're saying, oh no, we're going to outlaw the fact that even if something like this is banned, it will not be enforced.
Right. And by the way, those happen to be the same states also putting in laws to make it illegal to ask someone to have a vaccine in order to come back to work, go to school, or go on a cruise, thus risking not only all our individual health, but risking the entire economic return of our world of business and commerce. So the fanatics are winning right now in many, many states. And the few that see the light more clearly. I want to, in the quote I gave you for the book, I talked about the fact that, maybe the gay community are the last Christians or something like that. I forget how I put it. My partner who produces this show, Ernie, Greg, is married to a gay pastor, sort of flips your relationship in that you're the pastor. By the way, your husband he's not a pastor as well, right? I mean, misery doesn't love that much company.
No.
Okay. So you've got one person in your relationship that is not.
I don't consider myself, I always say now, I think everybody's a minister. Some people just get paid to do it.
Yeah, right.
And, that's where I'm at. I mean, occupationally, I'm a pastor in the sense that I just am a minister at heart.
Sure.
But I don't get paid to do it other than my work through Joel Speaks Out.
Yeah, yeah. But you are a pastor, and that was how you were trained, and you still are a minister at heart, and so forth and so on. And you're doing some pastoring right here, by the way, and so am I, in the sense that, we're reaching out to each other to help us. So anyway, this is a conversation with Frank Schaeffer and godly but gay author Joel Barrett, and we're on Facebook. Please like the page and encourage other people to sign up. You can watch on YouTube. This will also be a podcast and so forth. Having said that, maybe my connection with Ernie, who produces this show, and also with you here, if I can sort of push back a little here, my journey out of evangelical Christianity took me out of evangelical Christianity. I would not write a book where the title was Godly, but Whatever I Am Now. In other words, godly, but yours is godly but gay, and of course that's what you're doing. I wrote a book with more of a paradox in the title, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, which has had a lot of readers. And people would say, well, why is it so paradoxical? Are you trying to be a smartass? What's going on here? And the whole purpose was to say that I believe in paradox rather than the certainty of saying I'm godly. For instance, I wouldn't call myself godly. I wouldn't call myself a Christian. So why do I go to church? Because that's how my mom raised me, and I happen to go to a Greek Orthodox church. Why do I still pray every morning? Because I feel comfortable doing that. And of course, I would come back and say, you got a problem with that? In other words, do you have better reasons for faith than that's the way you are? Why do I like poached eggs on toast when I'm recovering from an illness with fresh squeezed orange juice? Because that was the comfort food my mom gave me. You got a problem with that? So there's a level of certainty in your godly but gay. I want to talk about the godly part. I don't want to drill down too hard and tough here, but what do you really believe is true out there? What is left of this Christian faith you were raised with? Irrespective of the gay part or your journey, Who are you right now? Are you an atheist who believes in God? Are you someone that prays but doesn't know if you're being heard? Talk to me about it.
Let me back up for a second and say that the title is very intentional. A lot of people get really annoyed by the title.
Yeah.
Because they're like, shouldn't it be godly and gay? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. In the world that I was in, you could be godly, but the moment you found out you were gay, you would cease to be godly despite all of the good that you'd ever done.
Right.
So it illustrates that contradiction of the world that I was in. It took me a lot of years, Frank, to deconstruct. And your book, Crazy for God, was really instrumental in helping me have the courage to really question some things.
Right.
And what I learned is that I was taught a very black and white world and a very black and white God, and the more I got out of that mindset, the more I realized the world is gray. It is not black and white. There's very little black and white. So I can't live in that kind of certainty. And I also can't live in the kind of angst that it's really, really hard to please this God and that he withholds the ability to even know how to live from me. We have to like seek it and search it and question.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is no way to live. In fact, if you look at the evangelical God that's been given to us, it is the perfect example of a narcissistic, abusive husband. It's like, oh, I told somebody today, so it's like be like a husband saying, I'm gonna make it really hard for you as my wife to please me, and I'm gonna withhold love, or I'm gonna, tempt you with all of these other things. If you give in, I'm gonna punish you, but then I will love you back to me. It's like, none of this makes any sense. So that was a real place where I started deconstructing and going, I don't think I like this God.
Right.
And I also felt like if we're gods, as we've been taught, prize creation, so to speak, well, these plants behind me, they bring glory to God just by being a plant.
Yeah.
They don't have to do anything. They don't have to grow taller, be bigger, do anything. They just exist. And I'm like, so why would it be made so hard for us? Why is it that us just existing isn't our purpose? So I've come around to, it's a made up term, but it really fit me. A friend of mine gave it to me and I loved it. I identify as a faithist.
A faithist, and yes, I like that.
I like the term because it's confusing.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like, well, life isn't black and white. So the way I define that is I believe. And you'll notice I don't say I believe in or believe that.
I believe,
I just believe. And I was like, I know I'm a part of something bigger than me, and there's more than meets the eye, I believe. I just don't choose to create a theology around that, name an entity after it, go to a house of worship. I live my life in respect of the fact that I feel like I've been given everything that I need to be the best possible person I can be. And I need to live my life in respect of that interconnectedness and being who I am.
Let me ask you a brief question. And by the way, I really like that explanation. I think that answers a lot of questions. I did a podcast a little while ago that's available, by the way, to all of you who are watching this, if you go to my podcast site, with Dr. Marlene Winnell, who does counseling for sort of post-evangelical PTSD. And one of the categories of people she's done a lot for are people who very much have traveled the journey you describe in your book, Godly But Gay, that I wrote an endorsement for. I wondered if you've run into her work, and if you haven't, then I would just say, here, you ought to go listen to her podcast with me and check it out. And other people listening to this should too, because this conversation with you, Joel, and my conversation with her would make a great two-part series, and should be treated as such in a way, because your story is the kind of thing she deals with as a therapist, with people who have not been able to perhaps think through their journey to the point you have yet. And so I would hope people would listen to the podcast I did with Marlene, this podcast too, and then again, and I'm going to plug this in really strong terms here, buy and read Godly But Gay, whether you are a gay person who's made a journey of some sort, or trans or non-binary. Actually, that's a distraction. Okay, forget that and just read the book. I don't care if you're gay or straight or whatever, because it's a great spiritual journey book in terms of being able to become this faithist you describe, in spite of. And then it sort of flips from in spite of to because of. Because without this journey, including the suffering, we don't have the book, but we don't have you either. How do you feel about that?
That's a good point. And actually, one of my best friends, she has said to me, how many other people are we keeping the world from even knowing because they can't be who they are? Right. She was like, what if you'd never had that opportunity? Right. And how many years were you kept from us? From being able to make a difference. And I often think about that. And, it's a gray area, because in a sense, yes, you're right. I wouldn't be who I am today if it weren't for all of that. So I don't look back and regret. I just acknowledge it. Yeah. But I also know that there are lots of people out there that are still living a life that's controlled by fear and shame. Yes.
And then not just in the gay community either. In fact, when I say just, the majority of them are in hundreds of other kinds of situations where they can't be themselves.
Right. And that's what I would hope people would get from the book, that yes, it is more. It's not just a coming out story.
Yeah.
It's about challenging these messages. I mean, I went to therapy myself, Frank, and one of my therapists, she ended up doing some EMDR therapy with me that was very, very helpful.
What's that mean, EMDR therapy?
I forget the words, but it's a trauma therapy, basically.
Okay.
And
So
I never really thought of myself as having trauma, but the more we talked about it, I realized that I had been given these messages that were constantly in my head that you are not enough. You will never be enough. You cannot trust yourself. You know, that I can't tell you how much that verse, the heart is deceitfully wicked. Who can know? It was pounded into my head.
Yeah.
I mean, and so when you live a life, 30 some years of preaching and teaching and believing that you could not possibly ever do the right thing or know the right thing.
Yeah.
That messes with you.
Yeah, of course it does. And obviously this is an area where I know exactly what you're talking about because you and I were raised the same way. You know, I'm going to switch gears here for a minute, and I'm not promoting my new book, although I will talk about it.
Go ahead.
No, we're talking about Godly But Gay by Joel Barrett. And this is Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And it is a podcast. It is Facebook Live. It will be on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do have something I want to read out of this book. I'll briefly hold it up. Actually, there's the poster right behind me. There it is. Okay. Because it brings up another subject that actually ties in with what I wrote about your book at the beginning of the book. And what did I say in terms of, I forget the phrase, but it was like gay people may be the last Christians.
Yeah, you said, few people seem to understand that the most religiously fervent and godly people in America are gay.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a reason that's completely different than you're going to imagine. It's not just because there are a lot of gay people in churches. Here's the subheading: to change America into a pro-family culture. This is my book, okay? We should emulate the total acceptance modeled in the LGBTQ and non-binary communities. That's the subheading. And I'm going to read this paragraph. How to turn America into a pro-family, pro-love, pro-relationship country that also has room for other people who do not have or want kids. I think that we have a good practical model for the revolution I'm calling for here, dedicated to embracing love above career, connection ahead of money, and community before greed. The total acceptance, other-oriented sexuality, and deep love modeled in the LGBTQ and non-binary communities. LGBTQ members made the right to be defined by what we humans most essentially are, love addicts, into a powerful political, social, and moral movement about decency, freedom, and justice. Now it's past time for all of us to expand on the LGBTQ community's fight for an open, inclusive, and more humane culture. Who each of us is rather than what we do for a living is the only thing that really matters.
Yes, that's beautifully stated, Frank.
Now that is what I mean when I say maybe the gay community represents, in the fullest sense of the word, the last Christians, because unlike all other communities in this country, because I can't think of one that has done what has happened that I'm talking about there, everyone else puts career first. Everyone else puts economics first. Everybody else puts gross national product first, growing the economy. As far as I know, there's only been one community, and it's not evangelicals who talk about family values. They're fake family values. They're anti-family values. If they were real family values, they'd be asking for a tax regime that would tax billionaires to pay for childcare and all these other things. But the gay community, going back into the 70s, is the only movement that I know in American history that has gone to the barricades, literally, at Stonewall and beyond, for the right to love. And it isn't just sexual love. It isn't just the right to bond with someone of the same sex. It's a different set of priorities.
Yeah.
And it's the only community that has lifted that set of priorities up Now, the weird thing is, in my book, that's the only community that has actually taken the words of Jesus literally in terms of the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, and redefined what the word success means. Because the gay community has been the only community that has made success in the area of relationships and the freedom to pursue them the bedrock of what it stands for. Not money, not greed, not career success. So in my book, repeatedly through the book, I use the gay community as the template by which a movement that redirects our idea of success toward love, compassion, empathy, they have given us a model. Or in this case, since I'm talking to you, Joel, and those in your community have given the rest of America a model. And that is to fight for the right to love as the bedrock of human existence. And I make a point of that in my book. And so I do not tie every interview I do into my new book. But in this case, it would be ridiculous for me not to, because I've thought about it a lot.
I really appreciate that, Frank. That's brilliant and beautiful, and makes me feel warm and fuzzy to have someone recognize that. And I don't know that I've ever put it quite into those words, because I observe in the LGBTQ community, to me, one of my passions is the relational part of things, because I see so many people that only know the heteronormative evangelical model of what it means to be a family and have a relationship, and they work so hard to try to emulate that. And I'm like, you do realize this is a failed model that you're emulating. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate the fact that you recognize that there has been some just do away with that. Let's start all over again. And I'm seeing that more and more. And one of my passions, in fact, I'm thinking about my next book being about LGBTQ relationships, because I want to set people free, so to speak, and be like, stop imitating your parents. Stop, it's fine. I'm not against those things, but take a fresh look at who we are. And
Well, and let's take a deep breath here and redefine what we mean by success. What is a successful life? See, in my book, going back to you and other married gay people that I know, I judge their lives the same way I judge mine. And that is, what really matters is what I see written in the faces of my grandchildren I care for every day. And my wife that I'm with, it has nothing to do with heteronormative or marriage relationship in that sense. But the people who are closest to us are the only people who actually, that we can look in their eyes and see truth reflected, whether it's fear or loathing or anger. We see what we really are. That's where I say the gay community is the only community that is sort of a self-actualized, recognized group of people who have said, look, no, we're not about money. We're not about profit. We're about the right to love. And it's so crazy that evangelicals have not recognized this truth while themselves becoming totally good corporate citizens.
Yeah.
So the way Franklin Graham and all these other guys run their organizations, it's all about the money. It's about the perks. It's about the private jet. It's about the nepotism, and you bring your family in and everybody's on board. It's money, money, money all the way down. There is nothing else. It's a vast criminal enterprise in the name of religious liberty when it comes to big evangelical organizations. And yet they stand in judgment of gay people who are the only people who actually in their lifestyle, as they would call it, which of course is garbage because it's not chosen lifestyle, are practicing what Jesus preached, which is you put other people first.
Two things come to mind. One is because I grew up, I always say I grew up in the bunker, so to speak. We didn't listen to rock and roll music. And you do not want me on your trivia team because I don't know half of that stuff. And I've kind of caught up a little bit, but I'm still void of that. So, but what I did grow up listening to was a lot of like American songbook standards, jazz standards and stuff. Sure. And I was just the other day, I was listening to Nat King Cole singing Nature Boy. And it hit me how beautiful that last line of the song is, where it says, the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, that's what I was thinking about as you were talking about that. And
Yeah.
you're right, that's at its most core level. Then secondly, a couple of years ago, some colleagues of mine started doing something called cult lunch. And we would take lunch together and watch a short cult documentary. And at first I thought, oh, this is going to be fun, all these strange things. And it wasn't very far in, Frank, where I started going a couple of things. One, this is an awful lot like what I grew up in.
Yeah.
And two, it's the same thing over and over again. The story, the setting is different. The people, the characters are different, but it all comes down to money, sex, and power.
Money, sex, and power. And in most cases, one person, usually a man,
yes,
who becomes this sort of, hey, another movie, it's not a documentary, but apropos of which I love the film, The Master. It's a really good movie. It's on my top 10 list because it just dissects the kind of community I grew up in. Of course, it goes further and so on, where it's all built around this one guru type pick person with these followers.
Yeah.
And it takes it, but it really got it. Really got it. By the way, I just want to mention, we have links to you. We have links to Joel on our show notes, everything. If you want to, people watching want to get in contact with Joel or follow what he's doing or ask about the book, we have links to Joel's site on our show notes. And you're watching Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We're talking
everything is Joel Speaks Out. That's the brand.
Yeah, godly.
Wherever you go, you'll find Joel Speaks Out on all
right.
social media.
Yeah, and you'll find him there. So I would encourage people to get in touch with you if they want to follow up, but also to get the book and read it. Now, I want to change gears here a little bit and go into a slightly different area. How do you see the future of the next generation of younger people coming through the evangelical subculture? Throw in a note here that even at Liberty University, which used to be Liberty Baptist College, started by Jerry Falwell Sr., who I knew personally, and I preached from his pulpit in my bad old days as an evangelical leader. There's a little bit of a resistance movement to the MAGA kind of Trump plan that's taken over that school from the board to the Falwells and so on and so on, which tells me that maybe there's another generation coming along that might see things a little differently than the way you and I were raised. How have you had contact with folks who are younger, not just who find themselves gay, but also just find themselves doubting or questioning? And how do you think your book might help on that?
Anytime you put a face on things, you humanize it. And so that changes the way people think about things. And so what we've been seeing is the younger generation, like when I was growing up, if you talked about the gays, it was out in San Francisco, parading around half naked at a gay pride parade. Those people out there in they would say, the land of fruits and nuts, kind of thing. So it was easy to hate them because we didn't encounter them, and we didn't know any gay people. At least we didn't think we did, But I think the youth of today, they have grown up with their LGBTQ aunts and uncles and teachers and friends, and they've seen these as real people. So then when they're in the religious setting or church and they're hearing this hateful language, it doesn't compute. And I think sometimes it's still a challenge to completely reject it because there's that black and white world again. But I do think the youth of today, this generation up and coming, is going, this doesn't add up.
Yes.
And I don't want to hate these people in my life. And so I have some very conservative relatives and friends in my life that I know stay in touch with me. And I know that on paper, they don't agree with me, but they still stay in touch because they also just know me as a person and they love me. And it may not add up in their mind, but I go, please stay connected to me, because at some point you're going to come to the realization that, wait, I've been hating, this person or the sin or whatever for all these years. I mean, my husband and I have been together 15 years. It's like, I want to be like, so
yes,
still waiting for the phase to end, or,
Right.
And I think that there is, when people scream the loudest when they're hurting the most. And I think what we're witnessing is a lot of screaming of a movement that is dying.
Yes.
It's dying, and it's last.
White evangelical fundamentalist Christianity is definitely dying, and it's aging. It's
And
also doing a hell of a lot of damage on the way out. Thank you,
they are.
Donald Trump, by the way, all you white
Yeah.
evangelicals.
There, he galvanized it all. But regardless, I do still believe that this can't last forever. These people are, it's just not sustainable. And once they get everything they want, let's just say in the worst case scenario,
right,
they're able to, outlaw all abortion. Let's say they're able to take away gay marriage or do all these things. They will have nothing left to coalesce around and fight. And we all know what happens at that point. You start fighting each other.
Yeah.
I grew up in those churches that it was easy to hate the churches that weren't like us, but then the churches themselves started fighting against each about who was closest to right and so on and so forth. So I believe we're witnessing that. I hope we don't get to that point.
Yes.
I hope that we find reason somewhere.
Well, and there was an article in the Guardian, doctors in the St. Louis area talking about evangelical white Christians who are part of the anti-vaccine movement sneaking in to get a vaccination, but they don't want their friends to know they got it. And that, of course, is a template for the whole thing. Right there. We all know it. And anybody who's ever known any abortion providers knows that it's the pastor's wife and daughter from the local Southern Baptist church who snuck in to get a termination. And this has been the pattern. And so you're totally right. And my novel Portofino, which, by the way, not a plug here, but one of the points of humor is their church keeps splitting and they keep having different acronyms and names because they can never. And in the end, it just was sort of my family, my sisters and me. And and I wasn't sure about Susan, because she was mean to me. And so the church gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah. It reminds me of a joke I heard years ago about somebody being rescued off of a desert island after spending decades on this island. And they were like, well, show us where you've been living. And there were 3 huts in this clearing. And one was where he lived. And then they were like, what are these other? He's like, well, that's where I go to church. And they were like, well, what's this one over here? He said, that's where I used to go to church.
Yeah, exactly. And there's one poor guy in there. So, yeah, I think you're right. But, a cautionary note to optimism, my Calvinist background comes through. Now we've got this happy clappy, it's all going to be fine because they're getting older and dying off. I lived in South Africa during the apartheid regime in the last 3 years of it. But apartheid was enforced strictly in South Africa for a long time. And really brutally since about 1947 until Mandela was released in 89 or 90. I forget the exact year, but you had 3% of the population brutally controlling. And what with our conservative Supreme Court interpreting all the law in favor of religious civil liberty, in other words, the right to persecute other people not like you in the name of God, if that's what your religion teaches. This is going to drag on for a while. And a lot of these people have guns and they're angry and they're mean and they're stupid and they're ill-educated and they're confused and bitter on top of everything else. So I don't see this sort of finish. I think the storming of the Capitol on January 6th was emblematic of the kind of eruptions of anger that we're going to be seeing. I mean, across the board. And these are not going to be easy times. These guys are not going quietly.
No, yeah. And I try not to be a doomsdayer, but at the same time, I'm also not, I feel you 100% on all of that. And it does worry me where this is going. I will say, I think that progressives, liberals, whatever you want to call us, is that we need to take a page from that playbook of the late 70s, early 80s of taking the long approach, long game, and saying, if we're going to really make change around this, we're going to have to start, getting people elected into school boards. And, because what we're seeing today is the result of what you and I both lived through.
Well, we were part of playing the long game.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, my dad is one of the reasons that the Federalist Society started, because he went around to law schools at Yale and other places and spoke to various Christian meetings saying, don't become a missionary or a pastor. Either become a movie maker and go to Hollywood and influence culture, or become a lawyer with the name of becoming a judge. In other words, and Michelle Bachmann, by the way, was quoted in the New Yorker a few years ago because they called me and they asked, is this true? Was saying, I got into politics because I read Francis Schaeffer's books, challenging my generation to the long game. Why aren't liberals playing the long game?
I think we believed for too long that there was just this inherent goodness, and that when people were given the choice, they would never go for that. We believed that. And it's like, well, we have January 6th now to look at. amongst many other examples. You know, we have public health being made a political and religious issue. You know, who to thunk it? You know, you're just like, I don't get that. So I think we do have to start thinking that, oh, well, that would never happen. I mean, I think during the Trump years, how many times did you think, okay, that's the low?
This is the line. This is it. We're done now.
Yeah. And that was before he even got elected.
Yeah.
So I think we have to start looking at that long game and saying, well, it worked. It worked for the whole religious right, that idea.
Well, and who do you think the Koch brothers were funding all those years?
Right. They
were funding the long game, the think tanks, the Federalist Society, all this other stuff.
And it, you know, it preys upon ignorance and fear.
Well, and now you have voter suppression. So they don't even take the result of an election anymore. These guys are not into democracy anymore, just into trying to win by any means.
Yeah, I just told somebody this yesterday and again today. I was like, sometimes I just go, I don't recognize this place.
Right. Well, back in the day when you were being raised and I was being raised, the people that I was being raised right, at least theoretically subscribed to democracy. They compared us favorably to those terrible communists and their lack of freedom and so forth. Now you don't hear vivid defenses of democracy by right-wing Republican leaders like Ted Cruz. These are anti-democracy people trying to justify stealing votes.
Yeah. It's like I say, it's scary. It's crazy and scary that I sometimes just go, I never thought I would see this. And I oftentimes try to put myself back and go, if I were still in evangelicalism like I was back in the day, would I be in favor of this? You know, I guess I'll never really know. I'd like to think, no, I would have never gone for that. But then again, I remember when I was a huge Rush Limbaugh fan.
Yeah.
So I have to say, maybe I would have been okay with some of this.
Yeah.
I think I would have taken that approach that I often heard. It was kind of like, you know, some form of God works in mysterious ways and God can use things that we don't understand. And, you know, and that's the blanket justification for whatever's happening is God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah. And they justify everything that way. That's how they justified Trump as well, by saying God moves in mysterious ways. So he said, grab him by the, you know what, who cares? It's okay. God used David after he committed murder and adultery. So, you know, and yada, 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 yada. You know, I think that one of the things we have to recognize here in terms of the long game is that, you know, it's like turning a huge ship around. I mean, the long game has succeeded for the right, and it's now pushing on sheer inertia. So whether they have the votes or the numbers or not, with the kind of lock on the courts that they have, with all those people Trump appointed, you know, we have a problem. And then it comes back to the issue you're raising in Godly But Gay, because of course part of that is now directing fire at the steps the gay community has taken in terms of marriage equality and these other things. They're now trying to reverse this. Yeah.
And I mean, it's something I thought when the marriage equality passed, I was like, oh, good. You know, and I think sometimes we have let our guard down and going, we had a Black president, we have gay marriage, we have, you know, and it's like, okay, now we can just sit back and live. And it's like, no, we're being attacked from every level, all of these things. Nothing is written in stone.
Yeah. What would you say, we're going to wrap this up in a few minutes here, but before we do, if you were taking your pastoral role, you know, what's the advice you would give people who are looking at the evangelical communities that you came out of in terms of the kind of thing that Vote Common Good is doing, that I was part of, touring the country and campaigning on behalf of congressional candidates and helping to flip Congress in 2018, with this theory that if we can just peel off 2 or 3% of the evangelical vote and change a few minds or sow some seeds of doubt, we can win, because these margins have been very slight in terms of Trumpian type victories. You know, how would you talk to people in terms of them going out a la Vote Common Good to try to change some minds? I mean, what is the point besides you have a gay relative that you know, forget that issue, but just in the general culture war stuff, is there any hope of actually getting some of these folks to reconsider their position?
Oh, reconsider.
or change and vote Democrat because they're more like Jesus, less hate-filled, less AR-15s and thousands of rounds of ammunition. And maybe that's not what Jesus wanted.
I mean, think actually, my challenge would be to our own community to say, we're not all ever going to agree on everything. And I feel like right now there's a lot of who's the most right. I call it the most woke awards, you know, and we don't want to play with people that aren't as woke as us. And I'm like, we're going to have to, I'm not saying let down our standards, but we're going to have to go, there's a bigger purpose here, and we're going to have to work together, even though you and I don't necessarily see everything exactly the same way. Because I feel like there's a lot of division right now, even within our own ranks of people.
Our own ranks being more on the progressive side.
Yes, you know, wanting, like I say, I don't know how else to call it, but it just feels like this competition that I'm the most right. And it's like, you know what, this is a journey, and we're just going to have to get on board and support some things maybe that don't line up 100%. But then again, what does, you know, when you really come down to it? And I always start feeling that same sense of the churches that I grew up in. I'm like, no, I know where this story ends. We won't get anywhere if we're worried about only playing with people that are just like us.
Yeah. Or, by the way, got the memo from last week on some language use or something. You know, while I was editing my book, I was, you know, look at me, you know, I'm an old white guy, okay, boomer from that generation. I'm doing my best. But you almost have to go online to check out now, you know, is it Latina or Latinx?
Yeah.
You know, do you have to add another initial to the acronym? Because are you missing somebody? Did someone decide they're, you know, and if you can't keep up, then all of a sudden you're not cool anymore. I mean, at a certain point, we've got to actually look at the bigger picture and play the long game and not be left-wing pietists.
Right.
Holier than thou. This stuff is not, this is totally redundant. It turns the culture wars into a joke. And it also means that we lose allies you would have had. Otherwise, you just can't, hey, I can't keep up. I'm done here. You know, that kind of attitude.
Right,
well, that's not me, but I sympathize with that.
Yeah, I agree. And I said for a long time when the string of letters kept getting longer, I'm like, can't we just all unite under a big Q? Well, then that got ruined when QAnon came on. So I'm like, well, there goes that.
Okay, that was the wrong letter. Let's change. Let's do Z. Yeah. Hey, I just want to remind people that you're listening to on my podcast or watching and listening to Conversations with Frank Schaeffer, and you can learn more about my guest, Joel Barrett, first of all, by buying his book, Godly But Gay, but also go to joelspeaksout.com, joelspeaksout.com. And Joel doesn't have a hard to spell name, so speaking as a dyslexic, Joel's easy, Joel, speaksout.com. And please follow Joel's work and support him and get involved with what he's doing, because I think he's a real visionary. And when you read the book, you'll understand why I'm so sold on just the reading experience of the book, as well as what Joel stands for. And so, Joel, I want to thank you very much for taking the time today, giving us both a platform to talk a little bit, to vent a little bit. I want to remind people to go back and listen to my podcast with Marlene Winnell, who is a fantastic therapist who deals with and offers counseling to folks who've come through the kind of deep waters that Joel has navigated. Thank you so much for being with us today. And is there anything that while we've been talking, we haven't covered that you were thinking, gee, I hope I get asked this and that I forgot to ask you?
I don't think so. I just want to say thank you for all the work that you've done, Frank. You've been a hero of mine from afar. I've really appreciated your work. You've been a real inspiration and an encouragement to me, because when I first came across you, I didn't know anybody else that was challenging any of this. And so it was just like the heavens opened up for me. It's like, oh, I'm not the only one. I've had these questions for a long time. So I guess my parting thought is don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Give yourself permission to question it all.
Yeah. Well, on that note of great wisdom, Joel, and kindness, thank you so much for spending the time with us. And let's please stay in touch about each other's lives. And I urge people to get in touch with you at joelspeaksout.com. So thank you so much for this time. This is Frank Schaeffer on Conversations with Frank Schaeffer. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'll see you a little further down the road, Joel. Take care.